Montana Territory, 1878. The bullet missed Jackson Pierce by inches, splintering the fence post beside his head. At 25 years old, he had survived 3 years as a ranch hand in the unforgiving Montana Territory by trusting no one and keeping his heart as guarded as a bank vault. Love was a luxury men like him could not afford. Out here, attachment meant weakness, and weakness meant death. He had watched too many good men fall because they hesitated, because they cared too much, because they let someone get close enough to matter. Jackson dropped to the ground and rolled behind the water trough, his Colt already drawn. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley, and somewhere in those shadows waited the rustlers who had been plaguing the Bennett ranch for weeks. His dark hair fell across his eyes as he scanned the ridge line, his young face set in grim determination. At 6 feet tall with broad shoulders earned from years of hard work, he was built for survival, not sentiment. The false belief that had kept him alive this long pulsed through his mind like a heartbeat. Connection was fatal. His parents had died when he was 15, his older brother shot down 2 years ago in a saloon dispute over a woman. Every person Jackson had ever loved had been taken from him. The solution was simple: do not love, do not trust. Ride alone, fight alone, survive alone. What Jackson wanted was clear as creek water. Save enough money to buy his own piece of land far from civilization, where he would not have to watch his back or guard his heart. A place where solitude meant safety. 3 more years of wages, maybe 4, and he could disappear into the wilderness where human complications could not reach him. He never expected that on this ordinary October morning, his entire philosophy would shatter like glass. The rustlers' gunfire had stopped, replaced by a sound that made Jackson's blood run cold: a woman's scream. Not just any scream, but the terrified cry of someone in mortal danger. He was on his feet before his mind caught up with his body, running toward the source of the sound against every instinct for self-preservation he had cultivated. Beyond the barn, near the creek that bordered the property, Jackson saw them. 3 rough-looking men surrounded a young woman whose horse had thrown her. Even from a distance, Jackson could see she was quality. A proper lady in a dark blue traveling dress, her blonde hair coming loose from its pins. She could not have been more than 22 years old, and she was utterly alone. One of the men grabbed her arm, yanking her to her feet. "Pretty little thing wandered into the wrong territory," he growled, his intention clear in his leering gaze. Jackson did not think. Thinking was the enemy of action, and action was all that mattered now. He raised his Colt and fired a warning shot that kicked up dirt between the rustlers and their prey. Let her go. 3 against 1, terrible odds. Jackson should have ridden for help, should have calculated, should have protected himself first. Instead, he found himself walking steadily toward them, his gun trained on the biggest of the 3 men. "This is not your concern, cowboy," the leader snarled. He wore a filthy Union coat and had the dead eyes of a man who had killed before. "Ride away if you value your life." "Cannot do that." Jackson's voice was steady despite his racing heart. The young woman stared at him with wide blue eyes, terror and hope warring in her beautiful face. Something about those eyes reached past every wall he had built, touched something he had thought long dead. The leader reached for his gun. Jackson was faster. The shot echoed across the valley and the man fell, clutching his shoulder. The other 2 rustlers hesitated, evaluating their chances. Jackson shifted his aim between them, his expression cold as winter. "Your friend needs a doctor. I suggest you get him to one before he bleeds out. And if I ever see any of you on Bennett land again, I will not aim for the shoulder." The wounded man's companions dragged him toward their horses, casting murderous glances over their shoulders. They would be back with reinforcements, Jackson knew. He had just made enemies who would not forget. But when he turned to the young woman and saw her standing there trembling, leaves in her golden hair and gratitude shining in her eyes, he could not bring himself to regret it. "Are you hurt, miss?" He holstered his gun and approached slowly, not wanting to frighten her further. "No, thank you." Her voice was cultured, educated, completely out of place in this rough country. "They came out of nowhere. My horse bolted and I fell, and then She swayed on her feet, shock setting in. Jackson caught her before she collapsed, and the moment his hands touched her arms, something shifted in his chest. She smelled like lavender and felt impossibly fragile against his work-hardened frame. This close, he could see she was even more beautiful than he had first realized. Porcelain skin, delicate features, and those remarkable blue eyes that seemed to see straight through his defenses. "You are safe now," he heard himself say, though keeping her safe would likely cost him dearly. "I am Jackson Pierce. I work for the Bennett Ranch." "Sarah Whitfield," she whispered. I was traveling to Bozeman to meet my uncle. My stagecoach broke an axle 5 miles back and I thought I could walk to the nearest ranch for help." Her laugh was shaky. "I realize now how foolish that was." Foolish did not begin to cover it. A woman alone in Montana territory might as well paint a target on her back. But Jackson kept that observation to himself. Sarah Whitfield was already frightened enough, and something about her vulnerability called to protective instincts he had thought he had buried with his family. "Can you ride?" he asked. She nodded, though her face remained pale. Jackson whistled for his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Chief, who trotted over obligingly. He helped Sarah into the saddle, trying to ignore how his hands fit around her narrow waist, how she gasped softly when he lifted her as if she weighed nothing. Then he swung up behind her, reaching around to gather the reins. The ride back to the ranch house took 20 minutes. Jackson spent every second of it acutely aware of the woman in his arms. Sarah leaned back against his chest, whether from exhaustion or trust he could not say. Her blonde hair, the color of ripe wheat, tickled his chin. She fit against him perfectly, as if she had been designed to rest in the circle of his protection. This was dangerous. This was everything he had sworn to avoid. But when Sarah turned her head and looked up at him with those luminous eyes, murmuring another thank you that sounded like a prayer, Jackson felt the first crack form in the armor around his heart. Eleanor Bennett, the ranch owner's wife, swept Sarah into her capable hands the moment they arrived. Jackson found himself dismissed to the bunkhouse, which should have been a relief. Instead, he paced the rough wooden floor, replaying the morning's events, unable to shake the memory of Sarah's frightened face or the way she had looked at him like he was a hero from one of those dime novels. He was no hero. Heroes got themselves killed. Heroes cared about more than survival. Heroes let people in, and that was the fastest path to pain this side of the Mississippi. "You look like a man with woman troubles," observed Tommy Sullivan, another ranch hand from his bunk. "Heard you saved some Eastern lady from rustlers this morning. That the same pretty blonde the missus is fussing over in the house." "It is none of your concern," Jackson said curtly. Tommy laughed. "Sure enough. None of my concern why you are wearing a hole in the floor and staring at that house like it holds the secrets of the universe." He stretched out, putting his hands behind his head. "Word of advice, Pierce. Eastern ladies are nothing but trouble. They come out here thinking the West is romantic, then run home crying when they realize it is dirty and dangerous and nothing like their novels promised." Jackson knew Tommy was right. Sarah Whitfield would be gone as soon as arrangements could be made. She would continue to Bozeman, or more likely, catch the first train back to wherever she came from. This afternoon's encounter would become a story she told at dinner parties. That time she was nearly assaulted by rustlers before a handsome cowboy saved her. He would be a story, nothing more. The thought bothered him more than it should have. Jackson tried to sleep but found himself staring at the bunkhouse ceiling, seeing blue eyes instead of wooden planks. Sarah Whitfield spent 3 days at the Bennett Ranch while her uncle made arrangements to retrieve her. 3 days that upended Jackson Pierce's carefully ordered world. He tried to maintain his distance, but Eleanor Bennett had other ideas. She drafted him to repair the porch railing, chop firewood within view of the kitchen window, and perform half a dozen other tasks that kept him in Sarah's vicinity. "That girl has been through an ordeal," Eleanor informed him with the no-nonsense authority of a woman who had survived 20 years on the frontier. "She needs to see that not all men are villains. You saved her life, Jackson. The least you can do is help her feel safe here." So Jackson found himself taking meals at the main house instead of the bunkhouse, sitting across the table from Sarah, intensely aware of her every movement. She wore a borrowed dress of simple brown calico that somehow looked elegant on her slender frame. Her blonde hair was pinned up neatly, revealing the graceful line of her neck. She was 23, he learned, and had been living with an aunt in Philadelphia after her parents died of influenza 2 years ago. "But Aunt Margaret died last spring," Sarah explained quietly over dinner the second night. "She left me a small inheritance, and my Uncle Charles wrote suggesting I come west to live with him in Bozeman. He owns a mercantile there. I thought it would be an adventure." "And now?" Jackson asked, surprising himself. He had not meant to engage in conversation, had planned to eat in silence and retreat to the safety of the bunkhouse. Sarah met his eyes across the table. "Now I know the West is not an adventure. It is real and harsh and dangerous." She paused, then added softly, "But it also has men like you in it, Mr. Pierce. Men who risk themselves for strangers. That counts for something." Jackson felt heat rise in his face. He was not accustomed to praise, especially from beautiful women. I did what anyone would do. That is not true, Sarah's voice was firm. Those other men, the rustlers, they chose cruelty, you chose courage. There is a difference. After dinner, Alina shooed them both onto the porch, claiming she needed to clean up in peace. Jackson knew manipulation when he saw it but found he did not mind. The October evening was cool and clear, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Sarah stood at the porch rail, looking out over the valley that glowed purple and gold in the sunset. It is beautiful here, she said softly. Terrible and beautiful at once. Jackson stood beside her, maintaining a careful distance. The land does not care about beauty, it just is. People survive here or they do not. Is that what you do? Just survive. The question was too perceptive, cut too close to truths he did not want examined. What else is there? Sarah turned to face him, and the dying light painted her features in soft gold. There is living, Mr. Pierce. Actually living, not just enduring. There is joy and connection and building something that matters. You sound like someone who has never lost everything. The words came out harsher than Jackson intended. Out here, connection gets you killed. The people you love become targets, or they abandon you, or they die, and you are left with nothing but grief. He expected her to recoil from his bitterness. Instead, Sarah's expression softened with understanding. I lost my parents, Mr. Pierce, then my aunt, who was the only family I had left besides an uncle I barely know. I understand grief. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see gold flecks in her blue eyes. But I refuse to believe the answer is to stop caring. Maybe the answer is to care even more fiercely because life is so fragile. Jackson wanted to argue, wanted to shore up his defenses against her gentle assault. But standing there with Sarah Whitfield looking at him like he was more than just a survivor, more than just a man who had chosen loneliness over loss, he felt something shift inside him. How do you do that? He asked quietly. How do you stay soft in a world this hard? I do not know that I do, Sarah admitted. But I know that when those men grabbed me, when I thought I was going to die alone and terrified, you appeared. You risked your life for someone you did not know, asking nothing in return. That kind of goodness has to mean something, Mr. Pierce. It has to matter. She was wrong, she had to be wrong. Jackson's survival depended on her being wrong. But when Sarah smiled at him, tentative and sweet, he could not remember why isolation had ever seemed like safety. The next day, Jackson volunteered to ride into Bozeman with Sarah when her uncle's wagon arrived to collect her. He told himself it was just to ensure she arrived safely, that those rustlers might still be lurking. But as he saddled Chief and secured his rifle, he knew he was lying to himself. Charles Whitfield turned out to be a thin, nervous man in his 50s who ran Bozeman's largest mercantile. He greeted his niece with obvious relief and thanked Jackson profusely for protecting her. I should never have suggested she make that journey, Charles fretted as they loaded Sarah's recovered trunk into his wagon. The West is no place for a refined young woman. Jackson saw Sarah stiffen at the words, but she said nothing. She had been quiet all morning, her eyes downcast. Now she climbed into the wagon beside her uncle, smoothing her borrowed dress. Mr. Pierce, she called as they prepared to depart, thank you again. For everything. Jackson touched the brim of his hat. Safe travels, Miss Whitfield. He watched the wagon roll away, carrying Sarah out of his life as quickly as she had entered it. It was for the best. She would be safe in Bozeman with her uncle. She would marry some respectable merchant or lawyer, have children, live the civilized life she deserved. The hollow feeling in his chest was just indigestion, nothing more. Jackson threw himself into work with grim determination. He rode fence lines from dawn until dark, volunteered for the most dangerous jobs, pushed himself until he was too exhausted to think. But every night, lying in his bunk, he saw Sarah's face. He heard her voice asking how he stayed soft in a hard world. He remembered the weight of her in his arms and wondered if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life by letting her go without a fight. You are an idiot, Tommy Sullivan informed him after 2 weeks of watching Jackson's silent misery. That girl looked at you like you hung the moon, and you just let her ride away. She deserves better than a ranch hand with nothing to his name, Jackson said flatly. Maybe she deserves to make her own choices about what she wants. The words haunted Jackson through the changing autumn days. What if Sarah did not want safety and respectability? What if she wanted something real, even if it was rough around the edges? He remembered how she had leaned against him during that ride back to the ranch, how she had looked at the Montana sunset and called it beautiful despite its harshness. November arrived with the first snowfall. Jackson was checking cattle in the north pasture when he saw riders approaching the ranch house. Even from a distance, something about their purposeful formation set off alarm bells. He urged Chief into a gallop, arriving just as 3 men dismounted in the yard. Jackson's blood ran cold. He recognized 2 of them, the rustlers from the creek, now accompanied by a 4th man who had the look of a hired gun. The leader's shoulder was bandaged beneath his coat, and his expression promised retribution. "Where is she?" the leader demanded. "The blonde girl, we know she has been staying here." "Miss Whitfield left weeks ago," Eleanor Bennett said from the porch, her husband Thomas beside her with a rifle in hand. "You have no business here, get off our property." The hired gun smiled, a death's head grin. "We got business with the girl and the cowboy who shot my associate here. They both need to learn about consequences." "She is in Bozeman under her uncle's protection," Jackson said, positioning himself between the men and the ranch house. His hand rested on his Colt, ready but not threatening. "Yet, she has nothing to do with this. Your quarrel is with me." "Oh, we will get to you, cowboy, but first, I think we will pay Miss Whitfield a visit. A woman that pretty should not be wandering the frontier. Terrible things can happen." Pure fury flooded through Jackson. These men meant to harm Sarah, to punish her for his actions. The thought of them touching her, frightening her, made him see red, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You go near her and every lawman in Montana territory will hunt you down." The hired gun laughed. "Law is a day's ride from Bozeman, and a lot can happen in a day. Maybe we will just have ourselves a little visit with Miss Whitfield, teach her some frontier hospitality." They rode off laughing, leaving Jackson standing in the yard with rage and terror warring in his chest. Sarah was in danger because of him, because he had played hero, because he had let her matter, because he had committed the cardinal sin of the frontier. He had made a connection that could be used against him. Every fear he had ever had about caring for someone crashed down on Jackson's head. This was exactly why he had sworn to stay alone. This was the price of attachment. Sarah would pay for his moment of weakness, and the thought was unendurable. "I have to warn her," Jackson said, already striding toward the barn. "I have to get to Bozeman before they do." "Wait," Thomas Bennett grabbed his arm. "You ride out alone after those men, and you will be gunned down before you make it halfway." "Let me send Tommy for the marshal. We will handle this properly." "There is no time," Jackson shook him off, his face set with determination. "The marshal is 3 days away. Sarah could be dead by then. So you are just going to charge in without a plan, get yourself killed trying to be a hero again." Jackson paused at the barn door, looking back at Thomas and Eleanor. They had been good to him, given him work, and asked no questions about his past. They deserved honesty. "I love her," he said, the admission surprising him even as he spoke it. "I did not mean to, I tried not to. But I do, and I cannot let those bastards hurt her, because I was too much of a coward to admit it." Eleanor's expression softened. "Then you had better ride fast, Jackson Pierce. And you had better come back alive with that girl, or I will march into hell itself and drag you back just to give you a piece of my mind." Jackson saddled Chief with shaking hands. He had spent years avoiding this exact situation, years building walls to prevent precisely this kind of terror. Love made you vulnerable. Love gave your enemies a target. Love turned survival into suicide. But as Jackson rode hard toward Bozeman through the November snow, pushing Chief to his limits, he realized something fundamental. Sarah was not his weakness. She was his reason. For 3 years he had been surviving, just surviving, going through the motions of a life drained of meaning. Sarah had shown him the difference between existing and living, between breathing and feeling truly alive. The rustlers were right about one thing: attachment had made him vulnerable, but they were wrong about it being a weakness. The thought of Sarah in danger gave Jackson a strength he had never accessed before, a clarity of purpose that cut through fear and doubt. He would reach her in time, he would protect her. And then, God willing, he would tell her the truth he had been too blind and scared to see. He was done surviving, he wanted to live. And he wanted to live with Sarah Whitfield, however many days the dangerous frontier granted them. The ride to Bozeman normally took 3 hours. Jackson made it in 2, driving Chief mercilessly through the snow. The town was small, just a main street of false-fronted buildings, but it took precious minutes to find the Whitfield Mercantile. Jackson tied Chief outside and burst through the door, startling a clerk arranging bolts of fabric. "Where is Charles Whitfield?" Jackson demanded. "Back office, but—" Jackson did not wait for permission. He strode through the store, his spurs jingling with each step, and threw open the office door. Charles Whitfield looked up from his ledgers, startled. "Mr. Pierce, what?" "Where is Sarah?" "At home, we have rooms above the store, but really this is most inappropriate." Jackson took the stairs two at a time, his heart pounding. He found the living quarters easily enough, 3 rooms furnished with the practical comfort of a bachelor unused to company. "Sarah," he called. She emerged from one of the bedrooms, blonde hair loose around her shoulders, still wearing her dressing gown though it was past noon. The sight of her alive and unharmed nearly buckled Jackson's knees with relief. Then he saw her red-rimmed eyes and pale face, and concern overtook everything else. "Jackson." "What are you doing here?" Sarah's voice was thick, like she had been crying. "Those rustlers from the ranch, they are coming for you. We need to get you somewhere safe." The color drained from Sarah's already pale face. "No, no, not again." "I cannot." "Hey," Jackson crossed the room in 3 strides and caught her arms gently. "I will not let them touch you, I promise, but we need to move now." "Why?" The question was barely a whisper. "Why are they coming for me?" "To get to me because I shot their friend, because you witnessed it, because evil men do not need good reasons to hurt people." Jackson forced himself to meet her eyes. "I am sorry, Sarah, this is my fault. I should have let them go that day at the creek, should have. Should have let them assault me," Sarah's voice sharpened with anger. "Should have stood by while they know. Do not you dare apologize for saving my life, Jackson Pierce." Charles Whitfield appeared in the doorway, clutching his ledger like a shield. "What is the meaning of this? Sarah, is this man bothering you?" "Mr. Whitfield, your niece is in immediate danger. Get the marshal. Tell him there are 4 armed men heading to Bozeman with violent intent. Tell him to come to the Bennett Ranch if he wants to find them." "The Bennett Ranch, but Sarah is here." "Not for long," Jackson turned back to Sarah. "Pack a bag, only essentials. We leave in 5 minutes. For a moment he thought she would argue. Then Sarah squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and gave a sharp nod. "Give me 3 minutes." She was as good as her word, emerging in a practical wool dress with a small bag slung over her shoulder. Her blonde hair was pinned up beneath a bonnet, and she had regained some of her composure. But Jackson saw the fear lingering in her blue eyes, saw how her hands trembled slightly as she pulled on her gloves. "We are going back to the ranch?" she asked as they descended the stairs. "It is the most defensible position, and Thomas Bennett is a good man to have at your back in a fight. Plus, if I am wrong and those rustlers do not come after you directly, they will hit the ranch looking for me." Jackson helped her onto Chief, then swung up behind her just as he had that first day. "Either way, we are safer together." Sarah settled against his chest as naturally as breathing. "I have to say, Mr. Pierce, my life has become considerably more exciting since meeting you." Despite the gravity of the situation, Jackson found himself almost smiling. "Is that a complaint? I am still deciding." They rode hard, but this time Jackson kept Chief to a sustainable pace. He scanned the horizon constantly, every shadow a potential threat. The November afternoon was bright but bitterly cold, and he could feel Sarah shivering against him. He wished he had an extra coat to offer her, wished he could do more than simply hold her close and share his warmth. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah's voice was quiet, nearly lost in the wind. "Of course." "That morning at the creek when you faced down those 3 men, you could have been killed, probably should have been. Why did you do it?" Jackson was silent for a long moment, watching the trail ahead, feeling the steady rhythm of Chief's hooves beneath them. "I do not know," he finally admitted. "I spent 3 years out here telling myself that survival meant isolation. Do not care, do not connect, do not give fate anything to take from you. But then I heard you scream, and I was running toward you before my brain could talk me out of it." "Instinct." "Something like that," he tightened his arms around her slightly. "Or maybe I was just tired of being alone and too stubborn to admit it." Sarah tilted her head back to look at him, and her expression was impossibly soft. "I am glad you are stubborn then." They were still 5 miles from the Bennett Ranch when Jackson spotted the dust cloud. 4 riders approaching fast from the east, his blood turned to ice. "Hold on," he told Sarah and urged Chief into a gallop, but the buckskin had already given everything on the ride to Bozeman. The horse was game but flagging, and the riders behind them were gaining steadily. Jackson made a split-second decision. About a quarter-mile ahead, the trail passed through a narrow canyon with rock walls on both sides, defensible ground. He pushed Chief into the canyon and dismounted, pulling Sarah down after him. "Can you shoot?" he asked, already knowing it was a fool's hope. "I have never held a gun in my life." "Then stay behind these rocks and do not move no matter what happens." "Understand." Sarah grabbed his arm. "Jackson, there are 4 of them, you cannot." "I have to." He cupped her face with one hand, memorizing the feel of her skin, the blue of her eyes. "Sarah, if something happens to me, you stay hidden until they leave. Then ride Chief back to town and tell the marshal everything." "Nothing is going to happen to you," Sarah's voice shook. "I refuse to accept that I finally found a good man only to lose him to frontier violence." "Finally found," Jackson echoed, hope flaring in his chest. "I have been falling in love with you since the moment you appeared at that creek like an avenging angel." Sarah's confession came out in a rush. "These past 6 weeks in Bozeman, all I could think about was you, how you made me feel safe and seen and brave. How wrong I was to leave without telling you that you matter, that you are not alone, that I—" Jackson kissed her. It was desperate and rushed and tasted of fear and hope in equal measure. Sarah's hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and for one perfect moment, the world narrowed to just the 2 of them. Then the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the moment. Jackson pulled away, his forehead resting briefly against Sarah's. "We will finish this conversation later," he promised. "I swear it." He positioned Sarah behind the largest boulder, then took up a defensive position with clear sightlines to both ends of the canyon. His Colt felt heavy in his hand, and he had a spare revolver tucked in his belt plus his rifle. Not great odds, but he had faced worse. Actually, that was a lie. He had never faced worse because he had never had so much to lose before. The 4 riders appeared at the canyon mouth. They spread out when they saw Jackson, experienced enough to not cluster into an easy target. The hired gun was in the lead, his hand resting casually on his weapon. "You made poor tactical decisions today, Cowboy. Should have stayed at the ranch. Should have let us take the girl quiet-like." "Not in this lifetime," Jackson said flatly. "Your lifetime is about to get considerably shorter." The hired gun's hand moved toward his weapon. Jackson drew and fired in one smooth motion. The shot caught the hired gun in the chest, knocking him from his saddle. The other 3 men scattered, taking cover and returning fire. Bullets ricocheted off the canyon walls with deadly whines. Jackson felt one tug at his sleeve, another kick up dirt near his boot. He fired methodically, making each shot count. Clipped one rustler in the leg, forced another to dive behind inadequate cover. But he was outnumbered and they knew it. They were advancing, coordinating their attack, and Jackson was running out of ammunition. This was how he died, he thought with strange clarity, not alone as he had always expected, but protecting someone he loved. There were worse endings. Then the sound of thunder rolled through the canyon, except it was not thunder. It was hoofbeats, multiple horses approaching fast from the west. Jackson risked a glance and felt hope surge through him. Thomas Bennett rode at the head of 5 ranch hands, all armed, all looking ready for a fight. The rustlers saw them too. Outnumbered now and losing their advantage, they broke and ran. 2 of them managed to get to their horses. The one Jackson had shot in the leg was not so lucky. Thomas and his men ran the fleeing rustlers down while Jackson walked over to the wounded man and disarmed him. "Marshal can have you," Jackson said coldly, "and you can spend your time in jail thinking about how you picked the wrong woman to threaten." Sarah emerged from behind the boulder, her face white but composed. She looked at Jackson, at the blood on his sleeve where a bullet had grazed him, and her composure cracked. She ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck, and Jackson caught her, holding tight. "You are bleeding," she said against his chest. "Barely a scratch." Jackson buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of lavender that somehow still clung to her despite everything. "You are safe, that is all that matters." Thomas Bennett rode over, a satisfied expression on his weathered face. "Caught the other 2 about a half-mile down the trail. They will hang for this, threatening women and rustling. Montana justice may be slow, but it is thorough." He looked at Jackson. "You did good work here, Pierce. Foolish riding out alone, but good." "I was not alone," Jackson said, meeting Sarah's eyes. "Not anymore." The ride back to the Bennett ranch was triumphant. The wounded rustler was tied across a horse, groaning dramatically about frontier justice. The sun was setting, painting the Montana landscape in shades of purple and gold. Sarah rode in front of Jackson again, but this time she was not trembling with fear or cold. She was warm and solid and real, and Jackson sent up a prayer of gratitude to whatever force had brought her into his life. Alina Bennett fussed over both of them when they arrived, cleaning Jackson's wound and insisting Sarah needed hot food and a warm bed. But once the immediate crisis was handled, once the rustler was secured and the marshal sent for, Alina shooed everyone away and planted her hands on her hips. "Now," she said to Jackson with the authority of a woman who had raised 6 children on the frontier. "What exactly are your intentions toward Miss Whitfield?" Jackson looked at Sarah, who was watching him with those blue eyes that saw everything he tried to hide. His heart was thundering worse than during the gunfight. This was more terrifying than facing 4 armed men, this moment of vulnerability and truth. But he had survived 3 years alone, and it had been hollow and cold and empty. Sarah had shown him what living actually meant. She had challenged his false belief that isolation equaled safety, had proven that connection was not weakness but strength. "My intentions," Jackson said slowly, "are to ask Miss Whitfield if she would consider marrying a ranch hand with more stubbornness than sense. A man who spent 3 years thinking survival was enough, only to discover that without her, he is not surviving at all. He is just waiting to die." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "That is the most depressing marriage proposal I have ever heard." "I have not proposed yet." Jackson crossed to her, went down on one knee on Alina Bennett's kitchen floor and took Sarah's hand in his. "Sarah Whitfield, I love you. I did not mean to, I fought against it. But you are brave and kind and you see good in me that I did not know existed. You make me want to be the man you think I am. Will you marry me?" Yes, the word was barely a whisper. Then louder, "Yes, Jackson Pierce, I will marry you." Jackson stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her properly this time, without the shadow of death hanging over them. Sarah kissed him back with enough passion to make Alina discreetly exit the kitchen, and when they finally pulled apart, both were breathless and smiling. "I have to warn you," Jackson said, resting his forehead against hers. "I do not have much, a horse, some gear, about $200 in savings. I was planning to buy land eventually, but—" "I have my inheritance from Aunt Margaret," Sarah interrupted. "It is not a fortune, but combined with your savings, it might be enough for a small homestead. We could build something together." Together, the word sent warmth flooding through Jackson's chest. He had spent so long alone, so long believing that together was impossible for men like him. But here was Sarah, beautiful and brave, offering to build a life with him despite the hardships of frontier living. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "The West is not easy, Sarah. It is harsh and dangerous, and I cannot promise you comfort or safety or any of the things you deserve." Sarah cupped his face with both hands, her blue eyes fierce. "I do not need easy, Jackson, I need real. I need someone who will face the hardships with me instead of pretending they do not exist. I need you," she smiled. "Besides, I seem to recall telling you that terrible and beautiful can exist at the same time. Our life will be both, and I am willing to take that bargain." They were married 3 weeks later in Bozeman's small church. Charles Whitfield walked Sarah down the aisle, still looking slightly bewildered by the speed of events. Thomas and Alina Bennett stood as witnesses, along with most of the ranch hands who had helped save them. Sarah wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, and Jackson wore his best shirt and pants, his dark hair freshly cut. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jackson kissed his bride and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. This was not weakness, this was not giving fate a target, this was the opposite, it was creating something so strong that even the harsh frontier could not break it. They spent their wedding night in a Bozeman hotel, and Jackson learned that Sarah was even braver than he had imagined. She came to him without fear or hesitation, giving herself with the same fierce wholeness she brought to everything. Afterward, lying tangled in sheets with Sarah's blonde hair spilled across his chest, Jackson felt peace for the first time in years. "I was so scared," he admitted in the darkness. "When I realized those rustlers were coming for you, I thought I would lose you before I even had the chance to tell you how I felt." Sarah propped herself up on one elbow, tracing patterns on his bare chest. "I was scared too, not of dying exactly, but of never seeing you again. Of spending my whole life wondering what might have been if I had been brave enough to tell you I loved you." "You are the bravest person I know," Jackson said seriously. "You came west alone, you survived an attack. You agreed to marry a man with nothing to his name but a horse and a dream." "You have more than that," Sarah kissed his shoulder. "You have integrity and courage and a good heart. That is worth more than land or money." Pretty words will not feed us or keep the snow off our heads. No, but they are still true. Sarah settled back against him with a contented sigh. We will build our homestead, Jackson. We will work hard and make a life here. And when things get difficult, we will remember this moment and know that we chose each other despite the hardships, not in ignorance of them. Winter descended on Montana with brutal force, but Jackson and Sarah Pierce barely noticed. They spent the cold months living with the Bennetts, working and saving every penny. Jackson took extra jobs breaking horses, and Sarah helped Alina with sewing and household tasks. They were building toward something, and the anticipation was almost as sweet as the reality. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and made plans. They would file a homestead claim in the spring, Jackson said, find good land with water and timber, build a small cabin first, then expand as they could, maybe raise cattle or horses. Start a family. That last part always made Sarah blush and smile, and Jackson would pull her clothes and kiss her temple, marveling at the impossibility of his happiness. By March, they had saved enough. Thomas Bennett helped them select a prime 160 acres in a valley about 10 miles from his own ranch. There was a creek running through it, good grazing land, and a stand of pines perfect for timber. Jackson stood on that land with his arm around Sarah's waist and felt something profound settle in his chest. This was home, not because of the land but because of the woman beside him. Sarah had transformed his understanding of survival into something richer and deeper. She had shown him that living meant building, connecting, loving even when love was risky. They broke ground on the cabin in April. Thomas and several ranch hands came to help with the heavy work, raising walls and framing the roof. Sarah worked alongside the men without complaint, her hands blistering and her face sunburned, never once suggesting they had made a mistake leaving the comfort of the Bennett ranch. By June, they had a small but sturdy cabin with a stone fireplace, a loft for sleeping, and windows that looked out over the valley. It was not fancy, but it was theirs. Jackson carried Sarah over the threshold on a warm evening with wildflowers blooming across the meadow, and when he set her down in their new home, she was crying happy tears. "What is wrong?" he asked, concerned. "Nothing." "Everything is perfect," Sarah laughed through her tears. "6 months ago, I was alone and terrified on the frontier. Now I have a home and a husband and a future. It feels like a dream." "If it is a dream, I do not want to wake up." Jackson pulled her close, swaying slightly as if they were dancing to music only they could hear. "I love you, Sarah Pierce. I love you for your courage and your kindness, and for teaching me the difference between surviving and living." "I love you too." Sarah rested her head against his chest, over his heart. "Thank you for saving my life that day, and every day since." Their first year of marriage was hard in the way frontier life always was. Too much work, too little money, whether that ranged from brutally hot to dangerously cold. But they faced it together. When drought threatened their small vegetable garden, they hauled water from the creek bucket by bucket. When wolves threatened their 3 cows, Jackson sat up nights with his rifle while Sarah kept him company. When winter storms trapped them inside for days, they discovered that isolation was not lonely when you were with the right person. Sarah proved to be an excellent frontierswoman despite her Eastern upbringing. She learned to shoot, to ride, to deliver a calf and butcher a chicken, and do 100 other tasks necessary for survival. But she never lost the gentleness that had first drawn Jackson to her. She still found wildflowers beautiful, still saw hope in sunsets, still believed in the goodness of people despite evidence to the contrary. She made Jackson better, softer where he needed to be soft but stronger where it counted. He no longer believed that isolation was safety. Instead, he had learned that true safety came from having someone who knew your worst fears and loved you anyway. In their second spring on the homestead, Sarah told Jackson she was pregnant. He had been chopping wood when she came out of the cabin, her face glowing with news she could barely contain. When she said the words, Jackson dropped the axe and swept her into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed and begged him to be careful. "Careful?" Jackson set her down gently, his hands going immediately to her still flat stomach. "I am going to wrap you in cotton and not let you out of my sight for 9 months." "That seems impractical," Sarah said, but her eyes were shining. "I am going to need to leave the cabin occasionally. Shopping, visiting the Bennetts, going into town. I will come with you everywhere, build you a special cushioned wagon, hire someone to do all the heavy work." Jackson was only half joking. The thought of Sarah in danger, vulnerable because she carried his child, terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. Sarah cupped his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "I am not fragile, Jackson Pierce." Women have been having babies on the frontier since the beginning. I will be fine, we will be fine. She was right, of course. Sarah sailed through her pregnancy with the same practical courage she brought to everything. Eleanor Bennett and several neighboring women helped with advice and supplies. Jackson built a cradle and made plans to expand the cabin, adding a second room for the baby. Their daughter was born on a snowy December morning, delivered with Eleanor's expert help. Jackson paced outside the cabin door for 3 hours, terrified every time Sarah cried out, certain something was going wrong. But when Eleanor finally emerged and told him he could come in, Jackson found Sarah sitting up in bed, exhausted and radiant, holding a tiny bundle. "Meet your daughter," Sarah said softly. Jackson approached the bed like he was walking on sacred ground. The baby was impossibly small, with a dusting of blonde hair and a face scrunched in sleep. When he reached out tentatively and the infant wrapped one tiny hand around his finger, something inside Jackson's chest cracked open. "She is perfect," he whispered. "We need to name her," Sarah said. "I was thinking, Grace, because that is what brought us together, grace and good fortune." "Grace Pierce," Jackson tried out the name then nodded. "It is perfect, she is perfect." "You are perfect." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, wrapping one arm around his wife while they both stared in wonder at their daughter. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for all of this. For taking a chance on a stubborn cowboy who thought he was better off alone." "Thank you for proving me right," Sarah said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "When I told you that caring fiercely was the answer to a hard world. Look at what we built by caring." Jackson looked around their cabin, sturdy walls they had raised together, windows looking out over land they had claimed, a fire burning warm in the hearth. His wife beside him, healthy and strong. His daughter sleeping peacefully, innocent of the hardships that would shape her life. This was what living looked like, not just surviving but building something that mattered, creating light in the darkness, love in the loneliness, family in the wilderness. The frontier was still harsh. Montana winters were still brutal, and danger still lurked in the form of wild animals, cruel weather, and occasional human violence, but Jackson no longer faced those challenges alone. He had Sarah, fierce and faithful. He had Grace, precious and new. He had a purpose beyond mere survival. 3 years after his daughter's birth, Jackson stood on his porch at sunset, watching Sarah teach 5-year-old Grace how to identify wildflowers in the meadow. Their herd had grown to 20 cattle and a dozen horses. The cabin had been expanded twice and now included a separate bedroom for Grace and a proper kitchen for Sarah. They had neighbors now, other homesteaders drawn to the valley, and Sarah had started a small school teaching children their letters. Thomas Bennett rode up the trail, his weathered face creased in a smile. He was getting older now and he had been making noise about retiring. Evening Pierce came to talk business. Jackson poured them both coffee, and they sat on the porch while Thomas explained his proposal. He wanted to sell the ranch and he wanted to sell it to Jackson. "You have proven yourself these past years. You are a good man, hardworking and honest. I cannot think of anyone I would rather see taking over my land." "I do not have that kind of money," Jackson said, though his heart was racing with possibility. "I will carry the note. You can pay me over 10 years with cattle or cash, however works best." Thomas sipped his coffee. "Eleanor and I are moving to California to be near our daughter, but we want to know this land is in good hands." "Your hands?" Jackson looked out at the valley, at his wife and daughter picking flowers in the golden light, at the home they had built from nothing but determination and love. 8 years ago, he had been a solitary cowboy who believed connection was fatal. Now he was a husband, a father, a landowner, and a friend. His false belief had not just been challenged, it had been completely dismantled and rebuilt into something true and strong. "Let me talk to Sarah," Jackson said, but he already knew what her answer would be. They would take the risk. They would work hard, they would build something even bigger than they had imagined. That night, lying in bed with Sarah's head on his shoulder, Jackson told her about Thomas's offer. She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Do you remember what I said the day we met? That there is living versus just surviving, that the answer to a hard world is to care more fiercely." "I remember." "We could play it safe, keep our small homestead, avoid risk, stay comfortable." Sarah propped herself up to look at him in the moonlight. "Or we could build something bigger, create opportunities for Grace, for other families moving west. We could care fiercely about our community the way we care fiercely about each other." Jackson pulled her down for a kiss, long and sweet and full of promise. "Let's build something bigger." They signed the papers in spring, taking ownership of the Bennett Ranch and all its holdings. It was terrifying and exhilarating, the weight of debt and responsibility settling on Jackson's shoulders. But every time doubt crept in, he looked at Sarah working beside him, or Grace playing in the meadow, or the growing community of families who depended on the ranch for work and livelihood, and he remembered. This was what living looked like. This was what it meant to care fiercely in a hard world. The years that followed were full and rich. Grace grew into a bright, confident girl who could ride as well as any ranch hand. Sarah's school expanded, and she became the heart of their small community. Jackson earned a reputation as a fair employer and savvy rancher. The Pierce Ranch prospered even through hard seasons, sustained by the same stubborn determination and fierce love that had built it. When Grace was 10, she asked her father to tell her the story of how he met her mother. They were sitting on the porch at sunset, Jackson's hair now touched with gray at the temples, though he was not yet 40. He told her about the rustlers by the creek, the desperate ride to Bozeman, the canyon shootout. "So you saved Mama's life," Grace said when he finished. "That is one way to look at it," Jackson agreed. "What is the other way?" Jackson smiled, watching Sarah emerge from the house to join them. She was 34 now, her blonde hair pinned up, her face showing the marks of sun and wind and laughter. She was even more beautiful than the frightened girl he had rescued 12 years ago. "The other way," Jackson said, "is that she saved mine. I was just surviving before I met your mother. Going through the motions, too scared to really live. She taught me that love is not weakness. That building connections makes you stronger, not more vulnerable. That caring fiercely is the only way to truly live in this hard world." Sarah sat down beside him, fitting perfectly against his side the way she always had. Grace leaned against her mother's other side, and the three of them watched the sun set over the Montana valley they had claimed as home. "I love you," Jackson told Sarah, words he had said 1,000 times but never grew tired of speaking. "I love the life we built. I love who I became because of you." "I love you too," Sarah said. "Thank you for being brave enough to save a frightened girl by a creek, for being stubborn enough to chase after me when danger threatened. For being strong enough to let me save you in return." Grace looked between her parents, so who saved who? Jackson and Sarah shared a smile, the kind of wordless communication that came from years of partnership and deep understanding. "We saved each other," they said together. And in the distance, as the sun painted the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson, the land they had built a life on seemed to glow with approval. The harsh frontier had tested them, challenged them, pushed them to their limits. But love had proven stronger than isolation, connection more powerful than fear. Jackson Pierce had learned the truth that would guide him for the rest of his days. The frontier was no place to face alone, but with the right person beside you, even the wilderness could become home.